Character crisis, right? So I have not really had that many situations where I've had a character crisis, right? Most of the time when I pick up a game, I usually know who I'm gonna play from the very get-go. But I'm gonna explain what usually happens, right? I mean the theoretical perfect character crisis. You pick a character that is approachable. As you get more comfortable with the game, you decide to play someone more interesting. This is very common in Xter, right? Like a lot of people they'd pick Sol, and then after maybe a year of playing, they'd swap to Milia or Zato or something like that. Just because the game, there's a lot to learn with the game, so they wanted to focus more on learning the system first. Usually, what makes this transition smooth is familiarity with the system mechanics. This last part is extremely important. We're gonna bold it. I know you guys like it when I make it bold. You do not have this process. There's probably something going on under the hood. So here's my thought process. I'm gonna give you 4 examples today. We're gonna go 4 ways I've seen this happen. Character crises are extremely variable, but there's one thing that's very important about essentially what could happen with picking a character and sticking with them. The worst part about this is when you are actively competing and struggling with being up with your main character, losing motivation for your character. You can obviously have character crises. So let's say you're picking a character. You can have a character crisis without even playing the game, right? There's a lot of characters that look interesting. Now, the reason why these two are separated, if you have a character crisis with one, you have essentially already stepped over this phase. So the reason why this phase is important as a 2, no matter what, it becomes easier to learn the less invested. Can any of you guess the difference here? What's this implying? What is this implying here? Basically, one is the implication that they have already chosen the best feeling character. Usually this means if you're actively competing, you've probably been in it with a character that's either very strong, and that's why you picked them, or 2, you've played them because you like them and you've gotten to a point, right? This usually implies that you're newer, right? Let's say I don't really know who to play in Street Fighter 6. There's a lot of cool characters. I don't know who to play. Obviously that's a little different. One of them is essentially detaching later on from something that may be a fit. So I'm gonna give you a story, I guess. We're gonna go down the list. H loves Sol and picked Sol on release. So this covers both aspects, right? Sol is very strong and H loves Sol, right? Over time, Sol gets nerfed and H progressively does worse as the game goes on. This as a process is very common. Now here's the problem. H stops having fun because they're not winning as much or generally as easily. Sometimes it's not even it's not even about how much I win. It's about how easily I win. And of course, winning is fun. When it comes to this on retrospective, maybe what H enjoyed was the way that Sol enabled you to play, right? Or alternatively, H just loved winning more than actually playing Sol. Sometimes it's easy to detangle your feelings of this character is fun versus this character brings me a lot of wins and that is fun. So this is the worst kind of character crisis, right? This process is fine, right? This is totally okay. The problem with this segment is that essentially because their definition of fun is attached to winning, when you are swapping characters, H starts doing worse because they're learning. Right? Now, this is where essentially people just loop their character crisis, right? Probably one of the most common experiences in fighting games. And you may think I don't really see that often. Sometimes even top players who let's say they make top 3 every tournament and then next patch they barely exist. They barely make top 8. They may just be they may go through the same process, right? The reason why this is very important is because the game was rigged from the start, right? The game was rigged here from the start to hit the New Vegas line. It's much, much harder to actually not only learn in this position, but also to learn a new character. Not just learn, but learn a new character. Learn game with strong character. Your fundamental understanding of the game is based around that top tier. Naturally, if you play Ram and you go to Faust, it's almost gonna feel like you're playing a different game. I mean, you pretty much are playing a different game. But it's just like enabled off of how you would be able to force things versus how you would not, right? They just know like, if I was right here, then I would win. But on this character, I have to guess 3 more times. And that may not be fun. That's like a very linear example of like, I guessed right once at this character, they die. I guessed right 5 times with this character, they break the wall. All of these things are not a problem, but combined, they are terrible. H's ego prevents them from learning, but they have no fun with their old character. H essentially loops between underperforming because they're essentially, you know, less motivated. This is like another aspect of essentially people idolizing tiers and things like that too much. They feel like they're trapped, but in actuality, it's more like they just don't want to do things because their ego makes them not want to go through it, right? Like, oh, I don't want to lose as much. Some people can kind of grind through it because they actually enjoy the aspect of they may just grind, start winning more and having more fun. And that's really what their fun is subjective on, which is fine. But it's important to be to recognize that, right? A lot of people are like, oh, I'm a little cow in a little character crisis, and then like, you know, they've swapped 10 characters. So let's talk about why this aspect is difficult before we continue, right? One of the worst things about learning a new character is the fact that you can play against a character and understand how they work, but not understand how your own character works. Let's say they do A with Soul, and you know with your character when they do A, you always press B. When you play a new character, you lose that security, and it can feel really bad through the lens of like, oh, if I was playing, you know, Danny Phantom, I'd be fucking sick. I'd wash them, you know what I mean? If I had Cosmo and Wanda Ogi, like literally you could probably do that, but you also have to understand like, why does it matter, right? I think that's like one of the key things is like a lot of the time we have knee-jerk reactions to things like that and we don't understand why. I need to think about what made me feel that way. This one is not as bad. This is basically just like an interest overload, right? Like where it's like, oh, I can't play the characters, I can't try them out. Too many cool characters. If you're truly struggling with like a character crisis here, a lot of the time you just need to play it. You know what I mean? You just need to play the game. You just need to play the character. There's definitely like situations where there's just too many interesting characters to choose. But you're always going to prefer one, whether it be like, you know, this character I have a lot of fun with in this sort of situation, but like, you know, maybe if I never play, I don't like playing against them, right? That's like a very common, that's a little bit of a boomer problem. I'll include that, right? No matter what, if you have an interest in a character, you're never going to be able to really like pick apart which one to play without actually playing them. You may have some aspect that like lean you towards some character. Like some people pick entirely off of like looks. Some people choose like primarily off backstory, like what kind of character they are. Some people choose like basically off of playstyle alone. I would almost always prioritize playstyle. In fact, I think one of the reasons why other people tend to have character crises is that essentially they go through this process where like, let's say they pick a character they just think is hot, and then they play further and they're like, I don't actually really like this character, this is kind of hot. That's very common as well. A lot of like the nuance, I don't like using that word, a lot of the nuance around this sort of thing is essentially something you can feel and figure out for yourself. I think a lot of this is self-doubt. But if you like the game and you're just having fun, you should just enjoy the experience. Basically, in this sort of situation, it's more along the lines of like, you just need to experience it and choose. You know what I mean? Like no one can really help you past this point. You can only like break it down further for yourself in this way of like, this character feels the best. If you're the type of person to be like, oh, I don't think I'll really like them in 6 months or something like that, you should also consider like, well, let's say you pick Soul and you're like, oh, in 6 months I don't really like him. Is that a problem? Like, is there like, what's the detriment to you actually feeling like that? What's the, like, if you want to compete, right? Like, you know, that could be a factor. But if you're competing, and that also leans it into a little bit of a different direction, right? Because you don't want to really be like if you're like, Faust is the most fun character I've ever played in my life, but I don't think he's great at competition, but I want to compete. I would say above all, no matter how difficult a character is no better pathway to growth and improvement than picking someone or playing someone you find fun. If you like really want to compete and you're like, if you care too much about tier lists, again, I think tier lists are like one of the worst. I used to really like tier lists in Exert, but I'm convinced like from Strive, it's like one of the worst things to ever exist. Like, I feel like tier lists in the context of like Strive actively makes the player base worse. Basically, like people just care too much about that aspect of it, and they just like just play the character you like, especially if you're new to the game. I mean, it's weird because like I understand from the layer of a competitive player, right? Like when I was in Exert, and this is what sparked a lot of my mental content, is I thought so differently about the game than like everyone else in terms of like casuals and stuff. And I cared about what casuals thought. And as a result, I basically had no idea. Essentially, my perspective of the game was fucked up. I had no fun. It was unhealthy. It was all for like basically no money. There's nothing you can really do besides just play them and like experience it, right? Don't be afraid of experiences. I feel like it's like the key thing, right? The worst part is if you have like a mixture where it's like you can't pick a character, but you have like an ego. Usually this comes from, let's say you're like a good CD player. Like let's say you come from, actually, you know what's a great example of this? Like Exerd players going to Strive, or like even Exerd players going to Uni. Like it's kind of similar in the same way of like, you know, they have an expectation of like, oh, my game's the best, I'm just gonna curb stomp everyone, and then it doesn't work out, and then like no matter how much fun the game is, they're just not gonna play the game. You almost open the door to them, like you open the door, like as soon as they step in front of it, you're like, you're gonna get hurt when you go through this door. So a lot of the time people are just like, I'm not going in the door, I'll go through later. That's basically what they do. They'll be like, I'll just go through the door later, it's okay. But then they never do. Honestly, I think these are like some of the most common experiences with it, right? What if I can't stop swapping characters whenever I see someone else playing them? I'm actually glad you brought that up, because this is basically what we're about to get into. 3 is, I don't really know how to describe this, but I guess it'd be like serial swappers. I'm gonna ask one question here. Why does it matter, right? Why does it matter if you swap so many characters? Like, why does it matter if you see someone else play a character you think is cool? Why is that a problem if you swap it out? It just means you found someone you think is cool, right? At the end of the day, like, a lot of time people essentially put a basis or put a, like, why should I, like, keep swapping? Or, like, why shouldn't I keep swapping, right? If you're competitive, this is bad. Because, like, essentially, it's good from the lens of you may learn how to play a lot of different characters, right? You may learn how to play a bunch of different characters at a specific level that may help you overall, right? Like, if you're constantly swapping to someone that's more fun, I don't know, that's not really a problem to me, right? But if it comes to, like, again, let's say as a competitive player, but I struggle to stick with one character. They essentially are like the dopamine chase. Learn new character, understand basics, have fun executing basics. Because they're like, you know, you get the dopamine. I understand how to play the character at a basic level. Then lose, swap. This is essentially how a lot of people tend to do it. Again, it's pretty close to one, right? It does not matter what character you actually like really pick, how strong they are. This is essentially another thing related to like, oh, I'm just not having fun because I'm not winning, right? I know this sounds weird after I've kind of gone from this, but when you're learning a new character, you can't have this expectation. No matter what. When you're learning a new character, if you're serious about it, again, like in the context of, let's say if you want to be competitive. Again, if you're just like a casual like player who just like wants to play whatever you want, like this aspect isn't really that terrible. Like playing the whole cast, like that's fine. I mean, there's even been players who have a large amount of characters they play from like a pool, right? You also have to understand that like when you're learning a new character, you're also kind of like, you're committing yourself to the process. You're not going to ever be able to cover everything just like without like playing the character. Like essentially what a lot of the time this boils down to is, I think I know more than I do. Alternatively, if it's like a character that is very strong, like it's like, you know, I could pick them and just win. That's like also very common, where it's like people play like a mid tier or like a low tier, they lose to a top tier and they're like, I'll just pick Ram and I'll just win. And then they pick Ram and they don't win. And then they swap back. If you don't commit yourself to the process of learning how they interact or how they win, sometimes you're not even playing the character, right? You're essentially just playing, you're like playing like a, you're playing prototype SF6 Battle Hub mode, where you're like running around fighting each other. Sometimes if you're not going to give yourself time to learn the, like even beyond basic, then you aren't going to learn how to play the character. In which I think in the latter case, if you just think everyone's cool, just ride it out. Have fun. You essentially, you are suffering from excess. Have fun. Play around with what characters are fun and just try to stick with one. If you are really, like, let's say going to in a month I have a tournament. Well, maybe you want to stick to like, maybe play around a bit, pick a character you want to stick to, and that's it, right? Really step back, right? Like, I mean, This is kind of what I mean from the lens of like always assess why you feel some way, right? If you are having so much fun with every character and you're just impressed by them, from a competitive lens, I'd be like, oh no, like that could be bad, right? But from the lens of like, wow, like as like someone who's like, wow, I'm glad you're having fun with the game, like that's great. And again, remember what I just said, no matter how difficult a character is, there's no better pathway to growth or improvement than picking someone or playing someone you find fun. Now, I can give you an example from my perspective, right? And I actually rarely swap characters, but I can give you an example in Soul 2 at Chaos, right? For the cow, like, I'm not gonna give myself a cool title. It's like, I played Soul since Rev 1 because I did not enjoy Johnny. I was a Johnny player in plus R because I like mid-range plus unblock. I did not enjoy Johnny because essentially he was not mid-range anymore. He was the screen. Well, he had unblockables, but they're so easy. Essentially, they got boring. Strive, right? Soul releases broken as fuck. Success is the core of his game plan, right? Everything is built around it because it's fucking broken. They nerfed Soul's success and prioritize a lot more close range. I am not as interested in. It was not because of like wins or losses, but specifically they started to prioritize him in a direction I did not like, right? Now, this sort of thing is actually not that bad. In fact, I would even consider this like a character crit. In fact, this is one of the most linear things you can do. And of course, this is a little biased because I have a lot of experience, right? But it's as literal as I enjoy mid-range characters, right? Happy Chaos is released at the same time. And so as a result, I just play Happy Chaos, right? Now, let's say Happy Chaos is not in the game. Unblockables, so I like command grab. I value a lot of mid-range stuff and things that make me not really commit. So essentially, priority on mid-range neutral, and usually I like high damage. If Happy Chaos is not out, who do you think I would play? Naga, exactly. I would have played Naga. In fact, if I had not played Soul in Exert, I would have probably played Naga on early. He lines up exactly how I would play. This is like a more direct case, right? So if your thought process is a little more complicated than this, you should consider what aspect you don't find fun, what aspect you do find fun. If you say like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, my default would almost always assume that like, oh, I'm not having fun because I'm losing. That's usually how it progresses. A lot of it is just boiled down into ego. This is another ego situation, right? I'm gonna help you avoid this problem. Specifically, I'm gonna help you avoid one, because this, again, is probably the most relevant and the most common. To be blunt, you learn fighting games by being carried by the character you pick. Does not matter if you're playing a top tier or if you're playing a bottom tier. You're carried in some way. When you swap characters, you are essentially unlearning the fact that you are being carried. You're trying to let yourself be carried by someone else or something else. The problem is, if you don't recognize this and you think like, again, you view it from the linear lens of like, you know, I do worse against this person because I don't know what to do, or like whatever, or like I could just do this or something like that. Essentially, that's applicable for everything. It's just like, it's the bias. It's the first, it's the player bias. I may not find like Soul's combo structure interesting, but see, I find this combo structure with RC interesting, which means that that's something I need to consider for, devising a strategy, not just playing, but also like having the most fun with him. Essentially, a lot of people just view like their character as the reason why they're not performing, when usually it's a lot more internal. It's usually them with a specific character, and that's it. If you are a bottom tier player, you may not have many other players who play that character because they're bottom tier. You are carried in some way. In some way, there's no way to avoid it. Your character facilitates you to play or do something that essentially you would not be able to with another character. I think a lot of it is a little more, again, internal. A lot of the time, if you're new to a new character or you're just new to the game, don't be afraid to just experience things. Don't be afraid to just play and go through it. You may not have time for everything, but I think one of the worst parts is people who have very strict timelines, not real estimations of their growth. Sometimes people do the thing where they're I have to be good in 3 months from now. I gotta play 7 hours a day. That's one of the worst things. Enjoy the process. If that sort of thing is a problem, then if you do that, don't do that. That's one of the worst things you can do. It discredits the growth and it discredits yourself, essentially. It's just so unhealthy. Yeah, it's an inner for improvement. It's not, there are ways you can improve, but you don't want to get looped into I need it now. So you can see why if you essentially learn how to play around system mechanics, your ability to play fighting games is a lot less, it's a lot less restricted. It's a lot more balanced around what the system can give to you rather than what you force from the system, right? There's a very big difference.